Good afternoon, Facebook friends and family. I'm Elizabeth Rich. I'm the commentary editor of Education Week. We're here at the Mayflower Hotel in Washington, D.C. We're at Education Week's 5th annual Leaders to Learn From event, where we celebrate the great work that district leaders are doing all over the country. So I'm joined by Angela Duckworth. You're a professor of psychology at the University of Pennsylvania, the founder and CEO of the Character Lab. You are also a 2013 MacArthur Genius Fellow. You're also responsible for the TED Talk that garnered about 10.5 million views the last time I checked. And you're also an evangelizer for grit.
Thank you for having me. I'm excited.
Yeah.
That's a lot. Yeah.
Yes, it is a lot. And I know you'll be going on stage pretty soon at our event, so we just wanted to have a quick conversation with you before that happened. So we titled this conversation, Is Grit the Secret Sauce to Student Success? But, you know, it's really more complicated than that, isn't it?
It is, and you know, it's a great opportunity for me to say it is absolutely not the only thing kids need to succeed. For me, as somebody who has studied grit as a scientist and experiences it as a mother, as a former classroom teacher, you know, it's not that I don't think grit is important, but I think if you use this research on grit to say that opportunity doesn't matter, or awesome teaching doesn't matter, or proper funding doesn't matter, or that class and race don't matter in today's times, then I think you're completely misunderstanding the research. To say that one thing matters is not to say that other things don't also matter.
Right, and you and your detractors have both raised the point that, you know, as you say, grit isn't the only key to success, but also that it's difficult to be assessed, and maybe it shouldn't be.
The topic of assessment is, you know, something that you can't really avoid. I mean, for a while, I actually just tried not to think about it. I was like, well, I'm just a scientist, and so public policy and accountability, and they're not what I do. But I do feel like I have a responsibility to say what I know as a scientist about assessment, which is first and foremost that there are no assessments that are perfect, and each assessment is imperfect in its own way. And in particular, when it comes to assessing for accountability, right, for putting carrots and sticks that you know, together with scores on something like a grit scale, you know, there you actually have, you know, heightened problems, because all those imperfections, which exist no matter what, you know, become exaggerated when people have an incentive to get higher grit scores, and when they get punished for having lower ones. So for a lot of reasons, I personally feel as a psychologist that grit and grit measurement in the context of high stakes accountability is not the way to go.
So, but what, you know, something that I think is interesting is also talking to children, you know, even maybe at a young age, maybe not using the word grit because maybe they don't understand it, but this idea of explaining to children the idea of, you know, goal setting and what's involved in that. What's your take on that?
You know, I think that one thing that's so important for all of us to remember, but every educator really knows this in their heart, is that all children, no matter how old they are, and all grown-ups as well, we're goal-driven, right? I mean, even 4-year-olds who are walking around on the beach, you know, picking up sticks for a sandcastle, even when they're playing at age 4, that's still goal-directed, right? Like, now my goal is to, like, I want to build this bridge, and I want to do... So we should recognize and celebrate, but also, I think, support the goal-directedness in children at all ages. I think, actually, people are happiest when they're pursuing something, and that something looks very different for a 4-year-old than it does for a 6-year-old, a 10-year-old, a 15-year-old as they move through life and as they move through our education system. But I don't think it's ever too early to support kids in developing future-oriented goals that are personally meaningful. And I think also, and this is another aspect of grit that has struck me in the research, most people that I interview who are truly gritty, truly passionate about what they do, their goal is not just a selfish goal. It is almost always a goal that has benefits for other people. And it's never too early to, you know, begin to support that in our young people.
Yeah, that's interesting. And that gets to the whole idea of effort versus pleasure, which is something else that you, I know, will be talking about at 1:30. But how does that intersect with grit?
You know, on the one hand, when you think about passion, you think about loving what you do. And actually, when I sit down next to a stranger on an airplane or on a train, I often turn to them and say, "Do you love what you do?" And that's my passion question. But loving what you do doesn't mean that you enjoy every moment of it. I'm sure you have your stories, I have mine. Every education leader has got to have stories about moments where love, enjoyment, fun, those are not the adjectives that would leap to mind, though overall they love what they do. So I think one lesson for education leaders, also for the kids who we're working with, is that loving what you do doesn't mean that you have to love every micro aspect. And when you do really love what you do, you understand that as a mature individual, you have to also take the parts that you don't love so much, and in some cases work really hard at them, because it's part of a whole.
So I'm curious, when you're on those airplane rides, how often does someone say, yeah, I love what I do?
So I get a range of responses. Right. I would say, let's see, how often do they say, I love what I... Well, I'll say this. What I'm listening for is not just the words, but it's also the reaction time. Mm-hmm. So if someone says, I love what I do, without a moment of hesitation, and then they enthusiastically tell me all about it, which usually happens afterwards, after they say, I love what I do, they want to tell me all about it, then I think, oh yeah, this person actually has a passion. And I would say that, I don't know, maybe half the time, people are able to enthusiastically and in that unconditional way say like, oh yeah, I didn't even have to really think about it very hard. And then when they don't have that reaction, then it's very interesting, because there are reasons why people are lacking passion.
So I'm talking to Angela Duckworth. We're here at the Leaders to Learn From event for Education Week. And my next question to you is, you have a line graph in your book that basically talks about how grittiness over time really grows. And it's pretty much a 45-degree angle. Why is it that grittiness gets stronger as we age?
So the first thing I should say about that data is it's my data, and it is data on thousands of American adults. So I feel like the trends are pretty reliable. There have been other studies of grit and age that confirm that there is a positive correlation. So I don't think it's a fluke. But at the same time, it's just a cross-sectional snapshot, right? It's just that, 60-year-olds in our sample tend to have higher grit scores than 35-year-olds, and they tend to have higher scores than millennials and so forth. The question is why, and there are really two reasons. Because it's a snapshot, it is actually possible that grit is a function of your generation, right? That if you grew up in the 70s, you're different as a person than if you grew up in the 60s or in the 90s. So this is the millennial hypothesis. I mean, a lot of people feel like millennials grew up in a different culture, and that culture has eroded their capacity for hard work, for sticking with things, for patience, for focused passion. The alternative, of course, is that grit grows with age, and that's actually called in psychology the maturity principle, that positive qualities tend to get better with age and experience. And I would say that most of the scientific data that's longitudinal, so that's more like a movie than a snapshot, that favors the maturity hypothesis overall, but we can't rule out one or the other. For me, what it says is that if you are, there with a 23-year-old in the office who doesn't seem to have the focus of what they really want to do in life, they don't seem to have clarity of purpose, they're not yet the kind of person where you'd say, yeah, that person knows how to work hard, overcome setbacks. For me, it's important to remember that person is changing and growing, and that if the maturity principle is right, or even if the cultural principle is right, it means that these qualities are malleable. Mm-hmm. And so that we shouldn't write people off and say, oh yeah, well that person just doesn't have grit, and there's nothing that will ever change that. I don't think any of the science would suggest that.
So are you aware of any kind of longitudinal studies right now that are looking at people who are born in particular decades that for grittiness or other character traits? There
are longitudinal studies, only a few of them, that really follow people over their whole life course, and that's the kind of movie data that I was talking about. Since the grit scale was only published 15 years ago, there are none of those longitudinal studies that actually use grit in particular. But some of this work, just looks at other things that are related, like conscientiousness or dependability, and overall, the data really do support this maturity hypothesis, and so it's indirect evidence, but from that it would seem to me that grit absolutely could grow with age and experience.
So I have one last question for you, which is this idea, you brought up the millennials, but especially for younger people who are raised on technology, I'm wondering, is there some grit aspect that they could learn about? I mean, for any of us, right, who have so many competing demands on our time, that can help us to manage that.
Technology is, whether you think millennials are shaped by different forces or you don't think so, it's undeniable that technology is just different today than it was when I was, 17 or 18, and I didn't have the ability to click out of my experience, with a swipe of my finger. And I have a family. I have 2 girls at home. They're 13 and 15, and I see these competing technological demands. Here's my advice. I think that when people are in flow state, when they're like completely absorbed in what they're doing, they're never in flow state about 3 things at once. In fact, they're never even in flow state about 2 things at once. So when I see my daughter on the couch with a cell phone in one hand with like Instagram notifications and text messages coming in, and then she's got her laptop and 4 tabs open on a laptop, and there's like music playing, and like I guess there's homework going on, I think to myself, there's just no way my daughter could be in the flow state of complete absorption. So maybe the thing is that, I don't think it's ever too early to talk about psychology with kids, and like, for them to be observant of their experiences, like what is it like when I do that? And like, out of curiosity, what is it like when I'm doing one thing with all of my attention? And I think actually kids might prove to themselves that they would benefit immensely, just personally, by having some opportunities where there is nothing else that they're doing.
And how does your daughter react to that flow conversation?
Well, they are teenagers,
exactly.
So it doesn't always go well. But I will say this, sometimes in the moment when I'm talking about this, I get the eye rolls, but it sometimes comes back, right? So in other times, my older daughter, Amanda, has recently taken to like studying when nobody else is around, and she kicks us all out, and she doesn't always do it politely, but I think she's recognizing that, she's a better thinker and a better learner when she doesn't have like lots of competing distractions, technological or otherwise.
Yeah, that's great. So thank you so much for sneaking in a few minutes before you go on stage, which I think is going to be in about 45 minutes. I want to encourage everybody out there at home or at work to tune in to edweek.org, where we will be streaming the event. And thanks so much for joining us today. I'm Elizabeth Rich. This is Angela Duckworth, and we'll see you next time.
Thank you.